Good morning. Well, I'm still recording on two cameras this morning, but I've got them close together, so I'll be looking at both of them more closely. I am glad to be with you again this morning as we continue our journey through the Beatitudes. And I just want to start off with, I said last week that I would explain a little more what that word means. Now, when we talk about the Beatitudes, we're referring to a section of Scripture where Jesus is preaching or giving a list of blessings. And we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. The Beatitudes start at verse 3. That word beatitude is kind of a weird word. It's not a word that we use anywhere else, but it comes from the fact that those passages in Latin were the first word of every line in the Beatitudes started with a word in Latin that means blessed, but the first part of that word is beat. And so the church began referring to them by that first word, the Beatitudes. And so those are the scriptures we're looking at this morning. And again, my goal in these recordings is for them to be around 10 minutes, and so please stick with us through to the end. It's not going to be a super long lesson, but just kind of a quick dive into these passages. So with that, let's switch over to the scripture and specifically just kind of reminding ourselves where we are and what we're looking at. So we looked at last week the fact that these passages take on a very different feel depending on which translation you read them from. So we looked at verse 3 last week. Happy are the people who are hopeless. But if we look at that from the NIV, blessed are the poor in spirit. Sounds very different in many ways, but I think last week we tried to establish this idea that they basically mean the same thing. So today it's similar. We're moving on to the next verse, verse 4. And in the Common English translation, it is rendered, happy are people who grieve because they will be made glad. And in the NIV, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. So once again, the reality is that when we think about these scriptures, I, like you, think, okay, these are like opposite statements. How can somebody who's mourning or grieving be happy? What in the world is Jesus talking about? Why is this even possible? What is it that he is trying to communicate? So I think oftentimes when we think about the word grieve or mourn, we think about when somebody dies. And I couldn't help but think as I was preparing to speak to you that I kept thinking about an experience I had as a chaplain. And some of you know that I spent some years spent about a year in my ministry journey serving as a healthcare chaplain. And I remember vividly an experience with a mother whose son was brought into the emergency room when I was the chaplain there. And it's a tragic story in many ways because her son died while taking a shower in their home. They found no drugs in his system. They couldn't explain why this young man had died. He was finishing high school, was about to head off to college. And you're like, wow, great story, Sean. But what so grabbed me about that story was just watching the man who died's mother grieve. And part of what was so moving in that experience was, as a chaplain, I had to just approach everyone where they were, and she was not a Christian, and I found it so hard to give her any comfort or any consolation without referring to Jesus in my life. without talking about my experience with the consolation that Jesus has given me in different situations. And so when I think about this passage and I think about that story and this woman who was deeply moved at the death of her son and just so broken over that experience, I think of this passage and I think about, okay, what does Jesus mean when he says, blessed, blessed or happy are people who grieve or mourn. Well, before we go too much further, let's just think about this idea of consolation. I talked about this mother. There was no way I could console her. And I love the fact that one of the Jewish traditions that we find when we look at the Old Testament and understanding how the Jews thought about the coming of the Messiah, one of the names of the Messiah was the Consoler. The Consoler. Someone who comes alongside Israel and is the consolation of Israel. When I think about this season in our country right now, between the virus and between all that's going on in terms of awareness of racism and the riots and different things, I am tempted to kind of grieve and mourn a little bit about those things too. And it's not the same as when somebody dies, but there's still this sense of unrest in my heart, in my mind, when I think about all that's going on. And so when we look at this passage and I ask the question, what does it mean for happy are people who grieve because they will be made glad? I think a big part of it is this idea that we find in the Jewish tradition that the Messiah, the one who would come, the one who would redeem Israel, was their consoler, that they would come alongside the consolation. It represented a renewal of hope, which is all through the scriptures, that the people who mourn and grieve will have new hope. And this passage in particular, in Romans chapter 15, for whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. So it would seem that part of what's going on in this passage is that Jesus is demonstrating that one of the main reasons he came was to provide comfort and consolation to us, his people. That woman I talked about earlier, the main reason I could do nothing to console her grief was that she had no belief that God was there for her. And I think about this passage, I think about this scripture, and I'm very encouraged. I think about the reality that even in the hardest things in life, that Jesus is our consolation. He is our comfort. And I could go through many different passages that talk about comfort, about the work of God being compared to bringing comfort. And but I want to close with one thought. This idea that part of why Jesus can be our consolation and our comfort is because he has experienced grief and mourning himself. Now, in the testimony of Scripture, we know a couple of instances of that. We know that he wept when his friend Lazarus died. Now, Jesus, of course, had the power to raise him from the dead, but it still moved him so that he was mourning and grieving that loss. He experienced that kind of loss and grief. And so we know that he, too, can relate to those of us who grieve and mourn. And part of the things that I wish I had more time to expand on today, but just to close with this idea that part of the reason that Jesus can even offer comfort and consolation is that he endured the suffering on the cross, that he's been there with us. And that ultimately, when someone comes to you and says, "Oh, I know how you feel," and you think to yourself, "No, you have no idea how I feel." Jesus comes to us and says, "I know how you feel." And he has experienced any grief and pain, any of the mourning and loss, any of the tension and the angst that we have experienced in this life. Jesus has experienced it. He can come alongside us and say, "I know how you feel. Let me offer you comfort and consolation." Okay, I'm running out of time very quickly this morning, but I want to just close with this thought for you to think about this week. What are the areas in your life where you pray for comfort and consolation? This isn't something we generally talk about out loud much. We don't, like go to our pals and wows time and prayer time and say, "Yeah, I'm really depressed," or "I'm really, really anxious about this," or "I'm just really grieving the loss of all of these things this year." Things that are, things like graduation, things like youth group, things like just family gatherings and birthday parties and those kinds of things that we can't do in the same way. That's still a sense of grief. And so what is it that you're grieving? What is it that you're mourning? Maybe you have lost a loved one in recent days, and you're still grieving the loss of that person. And I would just encourage you. That woman that I talked about earlier, she didn't have Jesus in her life. She didn't have the reality that God has come alongside her and said, "I know how you feel. I know what you're going through." But I would pray that you would do that this week, that you'd be able to pray, "God, I know you know what I'm going through. More than I even recognize, you understand me. You understand what I'm feeling. You understand what I'm going through. And I just want to pray that I could receive the comfort and consolation that only can come from Jesus Christ." Have a great week. I pray that God will be with you and you'll sense his presence. Again, we're going to be meeting on Zoom at 7:15 for youth group. Justine will be leading this week. I'm on vacation, but I look forward to joining back with you when I get back. And again, these new videos will be posted in Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram on Sunday mornings. And I hope you will take a look at them, and I hope that God can use them to speak to you this week. You are loved and you are missed. Can't wait to see you soon.